Observe, imitate, strike! Under the cloak of night, the prey becomes the hunter!
Hello everyone, JesterGio here, and welcome back to the channel. It seems discourse is bubbling in the Identity V meta right now, according to the recent Q&A that released. In the Q&A, we got balanced questions asking for both a Puppeteer buff and a Weeping Clown nerf. And while it is confirmed that Puppeteer will be getting adjusted, NetEase has stated they will monitor Weeping Clown in order to see if he needs changes. I think it's bizarre because Puppeteer is a survivor that has cemented himself into this game's meta while Weeping Clown can still be countered fairly easily if you play your cards right. That's not to mention that Violetta is now getting her web's placement optimized again and is slowly climbing the ranks again to that top tier spot she once held. That said, why am I even bringing up all this meta talk in the first place? Well, it's because the Goatman has finally released into Identity V and people are wondering about his placement in the meta. To rip the band-aid off, no, Goatman is not better than Opera Singer in this meta. I don't think there will ever be another hunter release who will rival the impact Opera Singer has left other than Ivy or release BQ. However, I do think Goatman is a really good and strong hunter in this meta, although not for the reasons people say he is. Whenever people talk about Goatman, they usually highlight how he is a strong, yet hard hunter to master, a hunter who can have his ability used against him. In fact, I used to feel that same way as well, especially from watching other people and trying him myself on his release. However, then I uncovered a strategy that has changed my perception on how to play Goatman and I want to share it with all of you. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's take a look at everything that's been changed about Goatman first.
Rising breeze in the circle of shadows. Soon we will hear the whispers and the rising breeze. So is feathers, smasher of the cage. Carven tails, legends will remain.
As written throughout my first look video, Goatman got some heavy nerfs into the test server, which carried over into the live servers. However, he also got a massive buff to compensate for these nerfs. So, let's cover all the changes that they made. While his stats remain intact, his attack got a few hits dealt to it. The recovery speed of his attack was increased and his attack range on both normal and charged attack were reduced. This is a fair change, especially considering how busted his attack stats were before these nerfs. They also reduced Goatman's starting energy from 60 energy to 55 energy, which is a nothing change, if I'm being honest with you all. You still generate energy really quickly at present 0, so the lost energy doesn't really hurt Goatman in any meaningful way. They changed the teleporting mechanics of cages, making it so survivors can teleport with the cages even if a part of it is on the map border. This prevents that hopeless situation in the test server where you're in a corner of the map and Goatman uses a cage in the borders, trapping you with no way out. Keep in mind, this only applies to the borders of the map, meaning areas with upstairs areas or thick obstacles will still trap survivors in the death box. Finally, they made it so the cages now extend down to the basement, essentially buffing his basement camp. That's all the changes made to Goatman's kit, a pretty small set of changes I might add. Before we move on, though, there's two things I wanted to mention while playing Goatman that I thought were cool. First, the backstep has a 1 second duration tied to if it gets extended whenever you teleport between cages. This partly explains how backstep works and why it can be used with cages for mobility, so it isn't all that noteworthy. What is noteworthy, however, is the second cool thing I learned about Goatman, which is that you can actually see the place you will teleport towards if you're close to the cage borders. I think a lot of the difficulty with Goatman comes from not knowing where you will teleport towards when you run into the cage borders. With this, it will help players ease into Goatman, as they can see where they will go to when they use the cages. There will be some situations where this won't be the case, such as when there's a wall blocking your view, but otherwise, this is a good tool to have. With that, I think I've covered everything important I wanted to say about Goatman. There will be some things I mention later on that make him good, but I can't find a good use for them in my matches as him. However, before moving on, I do want to mention that I will be combining the good and bad sections going forward. Doing these videos for a year now, I understand now that it's hard to fully break down your thoughts on a character if these two sections are separated. It'll be extremely difficult to talk about how good Goatman is without highlighting his issues and flaws beforehand. Because of that, I think it's just best that I combine these points going forward. So let's look at the good and bad of Goatman and see why he stacks up really well in this meta.
I seem to see face giving you like a sorrows.
Those are watching in the line, sleeping peace.
While Goatman can be incredibly strong in a lot of situations, I feel there are still some weak points to him that you should look out for. Due to this, I will cover the negatives of Goatman first before going over the positives and why I think he'll be a meta hunter. For starters, while his abilities can be used in chase and for camping very effectively, he doesn't have a way to pressure or slow down Cypher progress. Over time, we've seen newer hunters receive some form of slowdown to help counter the Cypher rush, with Ivy and her Doritos or Fool's Gold and his Rock. Goatman is one of the newer hunters who doesn't have a Cypher slowdown mechanic built into his kit, meaning he is susceptible to Cypher rush. That said, I don't think that this is really a sore point dealt to Goatman as some may think. Opera singer and Ithaca are both hunters who can still perform extremely well in today's meta who also don't have any abilities to help with Cypher progress. Their abilities are meant to help with chase and, because of that, they are extremely susceptible to Cypher rush as well. In fact, Goatman has a slight edge over these hunters when it comes to gameplay because he can use his cages to help his camp, whereas the other hunters have a much weaker camp. Besides, chairing a survivor next to a Cypher being worked on is already enough for your pressure, as you can easily contest both the Cypher and survivor thanks to cages. So while the lack of real map and Cypher pressure can hurt, I don't think it'll be enough to hurt his placement. What will hurt him, however, is trying to deal with tight kiting areas as Goatman. While the cages can be amazing at dealing with transition kiting, they really can't do much once a survivor is already in a kiting area. While your stats will make it easier to deal with these areas, the fact of the matter is you don't have an ability meant to deal with this type of situation. This is made even worse by the fact that you deal chip hits outside of your cages, meaning you can't just use this time to gain energy. You need to drop cages anytime you feel like you are about to land a hit, which can get expensive whenever you don't end up getting the hit within those 11 seconds. On top of being weak to tight kiting, the survivor roster can pose a challenge for Goatman. While he can deal with harassers and transitional kiters very well, tank survivors and stunners will be a hard matchup to deal with. True tank survivors will cause the cages to automatically disappear when hit, meaning a survivor who can tank multiple hits in one chase can be really crippling if you chase them first. Additionally, harassers who can stun will also be a problem for Goatman, as they can just use their stuns during chase to slow you down and can contain you for an extremely long time. Survivors with overall good chase stats, such as Wildling on Boar or Lawyer, can also give you trouble during a chase since their increased stats can make your good stats laughable, similar to Clerk. Finally, while he can deal with transition kiters fairly well, characters who can gain a large amount of distance quickly, such as Merc or Arrow, can potentially get out of the cages before they have a chance to be set up, wasting your ability in general. While Goatman's energy recharge is pretty fast, not knowing how to use it and losing all of your energy can be very crippling to Goatman. However, I think the final thing that can severely hurt Goatman is if a survivor knows how to take advantage of the cages or not. Since survivors can also teleport using the cages, a lot of Goatman's gameplay style will come down to mind games and whether you win them or not. I've had this happen to me where I'd place down a cage, but because the survivor knows how to play with it, they either gain a lot of distance on me or make my cage useless by containing the timeout. You can score early downs with the cages and their teleporting factors, but it can also be used against you to buy more time for the team. Because of these factors, I felt like Goatman would be an extremely strong, yet hard hunter to master. As you need to be smart about how you use the cages or else you'll end up struggling with this hunter. However, one car ride after release caused me to think of a strategy that, when used well, basically eliminates any of the trials and tribulations Goatman has to go through and lowers his skill ceiling by a lot. A strategy so efficient, so busted, so diabolical, that I have decided to stop using this strategy recently because it creates some of the most unhealthy gameplay for the survivors. The strategy is known as the Lockoff strategy, and it has everything to do with the discounted second cage you can place down 3 seconds after the first cage. Basically, wherever area or kiting route the survivor tries to make, you can simply lock that area down using one cage and then immediately drop down a second cage on top of yourself to gain full damage attacks. Doing this strategy, unless you mess it up badly or the survivor you are chasing is a stunner or tank, it almost always guarantees you a hit onto the survivor. You start off the match with 55 energy and gain 2 energy per second as well, meaning you can potentially do 2 lockoffs in your first chase, which can be enough to get a down. Since cages aren't tied to a cooldown as well, just energy, it means you can get downs extremely quickly as Goatman with the right energy. I mean, look at what happened to this poor patient, down 20 seconds after he was found. It's a strategy I found fun during the starting phases of it because it's fun to lock down areas and see the survivors try and adapt. However, the more games I've played as him, the more replays I've seen survivors struggle to even deal with this other than if I mess up. The more I really grasp how unfun and unhealthy this playstyle is. The Lockoff strat reminds me a lot of Release Bloody Queen before all the meta shakeups designed to counter her power effectively. With BQ's release, you needed to play a certain meta, one that consisted of tanks or mobility survivors in order to avoid mirror. Which led to matches where you don't play those survivors feeling unfair because of how powerful mirror is. It's essentially the same thing here, where it's an effective tool to use which will help you guarantee a down if you don't mess up. But is also a really unhealthy playstyle that sucks the fun aspect out of the survivors, which is the kiting aspect. I think the worst part about this strategy is the fact that, as a lot of people including myself realized, this is a strategy that NetEase has acknowledged and promoted using themselves. In the Goatman trailer, you can see 2 instances where the Goatman uses the Lockoff strat to block the Gravekeeper and the forward from going a certain route. And it's not like they just so happen to show this strat off without knowing it. This video is by far one of the most detailed gameplay trailers out there. This trailer shows off everything you can do with all of Goatman's skills, so I doubt NetEase didn't catch on to this strat being a thing. Because of this, I don't think this strategy will be removed and will instead be nerfed in some way. Whether it be a cooldown similar to Ivy's Bite and Blast or increasing the energy consumption of the discount, this strat is here to stay and will be the reason why Goatman will be a busted hunter. That said, I've also seen people arguing that this is a balanced strat because it's his only consistent ways to get downs and removing it will kill him. I'm sorry, but this is not true in the slightest. While this strat is his most consistent way of getting downs, you can still get really fast downs using the mind game aspect of his cages. There are many ways you can approach using the cages, whether it be using them to teleport yourself, drop one right in front of the survivor to teleport them immediately. Use upstairs areas to your advantage for drop-down hits, etc. Even if the survivor does teleport via the cages, you can typically follow behind then with your speed and eventually still land the hit when you're guaranteed to hit them. It can be extremely disorienting to go through the cages and not knowing where you'll end up afterwards, but his cages can be very effective once you adapt to it. Another thing in his kit that becomes effective when you learn how to use it well is the backstep ability. At the start of my Goatman run, I wasn't using the backstep all that much because I couldn't find a way to use it into my gameplay style. Even when I did adapt to it, I found it very finicky, it's sometimes just not working with the cages, even if I press the cage button. That being said, when you do learn how to use it and are able to use it well, you can get some really good hits in on the survivors, which can greatly shorten your chases. It's an ability that further forces the survivors to keep tabs on Goatman or else they'll risk getting hit by this ability. On top of that, it can be combined with his cages to allow him to gain crazy map mobility, being able to reach far distances in seconds. It's why chairing near ciphers is so massive, since it forces the survivor to leave or they risk getting hit by him using his cages. Speaking of chairing, another aspect that's really good about Goatman is his chair camp. Whether it be placing cages down to stall out the rescue for that extra bit of time or using it to warp survivors farther away from the chair, Goatman has a lot of things he can do to prolong the rescue. However, that pales in comparison to what happens when you find yourself trapped in basement. If you find yourself placed in basement, you should probably expect the team to sell you off because Goatman's cages make it so it is impossible to escape the basement if he has the energy for it. One really underrated thing about Goatman that I don't see nearly enough people using is his chip hit mechanic. It's damage that survivors won't be able to heal unless they have a chip healer on the team, and it gives you full presence, unlike most chip hunters. Because of this, I love to deal chip damage to the rescuer as they go into rescue. That way, I will make the next chase easier, as I only need to use one cage to deal full damage while I can also use the other to body block. The increased energy rate at final presence is also great since it allows you to get more cages in a shorter amount of time. Finally, while the vaulting block and the interactions debuffs don't really play too big of a role in getting hits or downs, they are still useful tools that can come in clutch in certain situations. Playing him myself, I can confidently say that Goatman will be an extremely good character in this meta, strategy or not, and I can definitely see him being played in tournament. He covers a lot of weaknesses hunters like Ivy and Opera may suffer from, with the exception of stunners and tanks. He may be hard to play as, but he has all the tools to deal with a lot of the transitional and harassment survivors in the meta right now, which is why I feel he will be meta. That said, that difficulty might make people reluctant to play Goatman, especially if they don't use the Lockoff strategy. Failing your mind games can be extremely punishing and can even lead you to lose matches. Because of that, I want to help bridge the gap between players and Goatman a little bit, so here are some tips I'm sure will help improve your Goatman matches. At this point, I don't think there's really a point to saying what final talent builds you should run on Goatman because they can all be good in certain situations. The only final talent I would honestly say you're fine without is Insolence, because you get backstep at presence 1 and your energy recharge rate is already fast as is. Plus, you gain full presence on chip damage hits, so there's really no point to running Insolence. If you're planning on running Blink, Trump Card Detention should be the build you run, otherwise Confined Detention Warp will probably be the go-to build for Chase Goatman. With that, I do wanna talk about some optional talents you can run that will help Goatman out, especially with his stats. Goatman has one of the longest stun times in the game, so running stun resist talents, such as Rage and Desperate Fight, can help reduce how punishing these stuns can be. Due to tight kiting being an issue and pallets being a bigger issue, I feel Destructiveness will be one of the mainstays on Goatman builds, similar to Opera builds. Since his attack recovery got nerfed, I can see Berserker being ran to compensate for the slower speed. That being said, I don't think it's all that necessary and his recovery seems fine. Wanted Order and Sadist can help with chair camping situations, Wanted helping you potentially detect the rescuer and Sadist giving the team less time to save. Giant Claw and Hospitable might be amazing at transporting survivors to dangerous chairs to help his camper deal out damage with his insane balloon attack. Seriously, look at how fast his balloon attack is, it would be broken if this guy didn't do chip damage, and it's still nuts even then. Finally, seeing how he has the second highest speed and a good heavy attack hitbox now, I can see a place for Impulsive to get certain hits. Goatman has a lot of potential builds you can make with his power alone, so I'm sure you'll find a build that fits your playstyle. As for general tips, the one thing you should do is get used to how disorienting the teleporting aspect can be. Your camera stays in the same direction during teleports, so you can often find yourself stumbling to realize where you were before trying to find the survivors. Once you do get adjusted to it, however, it becomes very easy to follow the survivors down in the cages and eventually land that hit on the survivors. I also recommend you don't swing randomly when you teleport and only do so when your next teleport can guarantee a hit. Most Goatmans I watch tend to get trigger happy and swing after teleporting, often missing and allowing the survivors to gain distance to teleport more. Remember, your movement speed is the biggest asset when in these cages, so just follow the survivors until you know you're close enough to get the hit and then go for the attack after the teleport. Survivors have a slight cooldown time before they can teleport again, meaning they can't immediately get away from you after a teleport. Because of this, make this your moment to finally land that hit on the survivors. It's also important to mix up your strategy and play mental gymnastics with the survivors. Whether it's placing a cage directly in the survivor's path to force them to teleport or use a cage to teleport yourself to their position, mind games are the key to succeeding with the hunter. For the lock-off strategy, it's important to make sure the cage you place covers the entire area you want to lock off. If you leave a small crack, the survivor can squeeze through while you can't, so be sure to be mindful where you place it. Additionally, make sure these cages are at the max size when you try to use the lock-off strat, as it covers more area and prevents survivors from immediately teleporting. Speaking of size, it's important to adjust the size of your cages depending on the situations. There are some occasions where you will need a much larger cage size, whether it be for map traversal or finding creative ways to cut off survivors. This can also help with the backstep ability, as finding the right cage size can mean a guarantee hit on the survivors. I also recommend getting the hang of backstep caging, as this can be a really good way to get hits onto survivors. It can be a bit finicky, I won't lie, but it's extremely reliable once you get it down. Just be sure to press the cage button only once or else you'll accidentally place 2 cages down. Don't be afraid to land a chip hit on survivors if you can afford it. It makes survivors vulnerable later in the match and can grant you the presence necessary to get max presence. I tend to use this on the rescuers, since it'll make it easier to just use one cage to wall them off for the down. For camp, either use the cages to stall out the rescue for as long as you can or use it to teleport the rescuer away. If in the basement, use the cages to primarily trap survivors in the basement after the rescue in order to potentially down both survivors. Like I said, basement is the scariest place to be in against a Goatman, so use the tools to your advantage to cause as much damage as possible. Always be aware of harassers around you whenever you play as Goatman. He has one of the best anti-harassment tools in the game, so look out for survivors and cage them if you feel they're trying to stop you from sharing. Additionally, you can also use cages to quickly reach chairs and chair survivors on them, thus losing a bit more time for the team to decode. Finally, note that Goatman will do 1.5 damage to survivors whenever dealing terror shots or detention hits outside of cages. Because of this, don't be afraid to use your cages at the end game to block survivors with the cages when they're injured or have chip on them. Before wrapping things up, I want to take this time to mention that you should play Goatman how you want to play him. I know I talked about the lock-off strategy in a very negative way because of its unhealthy playstyle, but I do understand that this is a strategy that works for a lot of players. At the end of the day, if you want to win as Hunter and feel this strategy will help you get wins, go for it. That said, I do recommend you still practice and get the hang of the mind game aspect of Goatman's cages. Not only is it more fun for both you and the survivors to try and outplay each other, but it can also be extremely rewarding for you as the hunter. Both methods have the chance to get you some really fast downs that can rival that of opera singer. Goatman has a lot of playstyles and ways to play him, so I hope you all will take the time to learn and hone in on all those playstyles. That about wraps up my thoughts on Goatman, a hunter with a simple kit that runs far deeper than people anticipated. At the start of playing Goatman, I felt like he was gonna be a TIE hunter with win potential similar to Anne. However, actually playing the hunter for a while, I definitely see the potential of this hunter being an absolute menace in the meta and even become a priority ban in rank. While Goatman does have clear flaws that'll make him less consistent, I do think he still has what it takes to do well in rank and tournaments. With that said, that's all the time I have for today. The next video will be that video I promised on Postman, so look forward to that. Until then, thank you so much for watching and I will see all of you next time.